Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, the podcast for consciousness conversations. We are your hosts. I'm Jeffrey Stegman.
And I'm Clayton Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we are here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. From your food to your relationships, let's explore consciousness together.
In this week's episode, we discuss a little of our background, some models of consciousness for you to explore, and everyday examples of how fields of consciousness are already present in your life and how you may be experiencing them. Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome to the Fields of Consciousness. Glad to be here with you today. We're going to start at the beginning. Clayton, would you like to talk about how you first became interested in consciousness?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So this is episode 1. We're going back to the start of our journey into trying to understand life better, I suppose would be one way to say it. And all of us have our journey, and there's been a few people that wanted us to go back to the kind of the beginning. So I don't know if the high school is the beginning, but it seems like my beginning in terms of exploring consciousness. There comes a point when you start to develop your own individuality and become curious about why other people are the way they are, and how you can change yourself to take on some of those attributes of others that you respect and admire. And so that was really apparent to me in high school as I started to see, different friends of mine that I respected be able to do things fairly naturally that I struggled with doing or that I couldn't do. And I seen them do things that they had to work really hard at that I found more natural. And so in terms of influences back then, it was more general personal development, the books. Dale Carnegie's work was pretty popular because back when I was in high school, it was in the 80s. And there was different speakers. And in the West, we tend to have personal development speakers who are like cultural gurus. Whereas in the East, they have, traditional religion or spirituality, and they have their gurus within that. I was brought up in a church setting, so there was certainly the influence of the Bible. But I didn't relate as much to that as I related to individuals that I wanted to be like. So I read biographies of people, and I won't get into any of the specifics because some of the people's biographies that I read didn't turn out to be the people that I wanted to follow in all parts of the life. You know how that works. So, and then after high school and I started working, it was more about the technical part of consciousness in terms of managing time and being clear about my values and having my values run my time instead of the demands of the outside world. That was a really big change for me when I switched that model of thinking. In fact, I worked for the largest time management training company in the world at one point, and ended up getting into the coaching part of that as opposed to the sales part because I wasn't very good at the selling, but the coaching I felt come pretty naturally. Because I had some training in life skills coaching before that. And shortly after the life skills coaches training, I did business coaching with this large time management company. And then I did another personal coaching training after that. So I went to 3 different coaching schools, and that was my career from about 1995 on. I had a few part-time jobs as I built my practice. And And sometimes my practice was part-time and I had a full-time job until it got established. Before I got into coaching, I worked for private schools for 11 years because I really enjoyed education. And I was also part of an Eastern-based philosophy for 11 years. I was very committed to that and quite active, as many were in that organization. And of course, we did a lot of comparative studies of different philosophies. And that's while I was going to working for these schools part-time and oftentimes taking courses through the schools. So it was more of I think a career planning focus, my interest in consciousness in my 20s and early 30s, because of trying to be established in the world and find joy in work. And I was involved in men's groups for 10 years. I've spent thousands and thousands of hours in different process groups. I won't mention them all, but yeah, thousands of hours. And spent a lot of time doing personal development seminars, a lot of time in group work. And then after I was in coaching for about 9 years, I had a personal coaching practice, personal and business coaching. My main focus was entrepreneurs who considered business their spiritual path. And I had, some senior executives, including Fortune 500 senior VPs. And so that was a big part of my influence in my 30s. And then in 2004, I came across Dr. David Hawkins' work. And I'd been in coaching for about 9 years then. And I think I had 4 people tell me about his work. So I finally figured out the universe was trying to, send me a message. And I read Power versus Force, and my life changed. I actually believed it was possible to do kinesiology. I think that's probably enough for this piece, Jeff. So I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, it's great to hear about that history of you learning kinesiology or muscle testing and following Dr. David Hawkins' work. And yeah, I really enjoyed his work too. And yeah, the idea of freedom, I think that was really intertwined for me early on too, with consciousness. And it's become a big part of FLFE, people being free. How do we all become more free? And, early on, I read science fiction to be free. When I was really young, I was just immersed in it, and it was all these worlds, all these life forms, different forms of intelligence. And it was so fascinating to me that, it just opened up, the whole universe as part of my world. I just felt so much freedom there. And I sort of transferred that to, undersea interest. And I was interested in marine biology. I went to this sea camp in Florida where we worked with dolphins. We did dolphin training, and just seeing the intelligence, the non-human intelligence there, the non-human consciousness, led me to Dr. John C. Lilly, who wrote The Mind of the Dolphin, which was just a fascinating study where it was a woman and a dolphin living together in a house that they built in St. Thomas for this, where it was just like shallow water and the dolphins running around and they're interacting, and the level of consciousness or the intelligence of the dolphins that they were working with was to such an extent, and that they eventually let them all go. So it made quite an impression on me at the time. And so I, that the idea that consciousness is only in people, is only in humans, just kind of went out the door for me. And it led me to John Lilly's second book, or I don't know if it's second, but his Center of the Cyclone book, which was subtitled Looking into Inner Space. I don't know if you've ever read that one, Clayton, but he had a near-death experience, and he went down the tunnel, just the kind of traditional near death experience. So met his guides talked to him. They sent him back. No, there's more for you to do in this life. So he worked to recreate that with sensory deprivation float tanks. Those were kind of the rage in the 60s and 70s, and he would do it with LSD, and he could get into some of the same spaces. So of course, age 14, I tried to reproduce that myself. It's like in a closet. Of course, it wasn't quite a float tank. I'm like in a closet laying on the floor. And I didn't quite get there, but it was like I was exploring. I really wanted to have that freedom and explore the inner consciousness and what that meant. And at 15, my mother gave me the gift of transcendental meditation. We did it together. And just that took me into the inner realms, without using drugs. The longer and more fruitful path from my experience. But it's down the rabbit hole in near-death experiences, reading books about that and evidence of past lives. One of my pivotal books, kind of first spiritual book, was Many Lives, Many Masters. But I also read, Yogananda and other things. So, and meanwhile, I was in business. Like, how do we bring consciousness to light in business and freedom around, kind of around belief systems and societal belief systems that, kind of impose a type of consciousness on us, and how do we become free of that and create our own way of being together that has freedom for everyone. So yeah, that's really where I, got started as a young man. And then, I met you, Clayton. I was working with a coach, Jim Follett, and we were working on meaning and purpose in business. I always felt like I needed a coach and always used someone to help me develop. And at some point he said, I've taken you as far as I can. I'm going to pass you off to Clayton Stedman to work with you. And so we started to work together. And that's where I really saw the power of kinesiology, the muscle testing that you were doing, and you were measuring my consciousness in all these different areas. It was just amazing, Clayton, that whole process where I really, you would find those low consciousness spots that I thought nobody would knows about this. I can hide this really well, but it just, the kinesiology is just the truth. It just takes us to the truth. And then that low spot of my consciousness with some energetic medicine, I could start to move it up and be more free. Be free of those beliefs about myself, about others, father, son, societal, business. There were so many, it seemed, thought forms and consciousness patterns that were not me, but they were there in my awareness. So that's when I really started to open up into, consciousness is not just my thoughts. There's so much more else happening there. And then I'd love to hear your view on the service projects, the first, getting started and with the inventor and.
Yeah. Well, I had a real health challenge in 2008, and I'd started looking for different techniques to measure the level of appropriateness to heal the health challenge I was having. And I came across this inventor who had a technology that tested as the most appropriate technology to help the condition I had. And I was doing lots of things like, mega dosing vitamin C and other supplements, drinking alkalized water, changed my diet. I tried different diets. And I was at the point where I couldn't walk in a straight line. It was a pretty, I was getting, close to exiting, I would say. I think it was an exit point, and came across this technology and met this inventor. And as soon as I started experimenting with the technology, I started getting really really quick. And we ended up spending a lot of time together. And eventually I was, talking to people about this. I was pretty inspired and in awe of the potential to help people with this technology. And we don't use it for health as such. We use it for consciousness, so we don't make any health claims, but it did certainly help me. And then, I told Jeff about this technology, and we're both kind of gearheads. So eventually we flew up to meet the inventor, and we got to see the technology, an early version of it, kind of like the Model T, the Model T compared to the current Tesla, if you want to use that metaphor. But that was, we're still looking into different technologies, and we use kinesiology to measure the level of consciousness of the technology and the level of appropriateness of it in a certain context. And we'll eventually get into more about how to measure things, but we're still looking to this day. And so it's been 14 years since I've been playing with experimenting with what is now the FLFE system. And I always enjoyed that story, Jeff. You tell about the first time we went into the inventor's home.
So this is, we call it a consciousness technology, and I really felt it in my body. I mean, I walked into this inventor's home. Clayton and I went in together, met his dog, met us in the yard, and it was kind of a messy bachelor house, but it's like my hair stood up. I mean, there was just a feeling in my body of energy, like the core of my body or my being was lit up with light or energy. I just felt like energized, like I could just run around the house. And after we were there for a couple of hours, then we went to lunch down the street. We just walked up the street, and everyone in the restaurant was so beautiful. I mean, I could just see their story. I could just see what was beautiful about them. And I was having an enlightenment experience where I was really seeing beyond sight. I was really felt like I was seeing into those people. And it was such a beautiful experience. I'm like, all right, we've got to work with this. This is really, there was a consciousness field there. There was a feeling and an experience of being in that space that we discovered we could recreate. And that's the basis of FLFE, that we could activate that same environment anywhere in the world with this quantum connection that occurs with this technology. So that's really how we started FLFE, and we just ran with it, doing service work. That was a wild time, Clayton.
Yeah, we came across this technology, and we started wondering, well, what can we do with it? And one of the discoveries was we found out the quantum association that was possible was a non-local phenomena. I think much like Dr. Hawkins discovered that, Dr. David Hawkins, he's author of Power versus Force and many other books. We use his scale of consciousness to measure things. That's our typical scale. I think Dr. Hawkins discovered kinesiology as a non-local phenomena, so that if Jeff and I were like in the same room, we could do some testing on supplements. That's a local phenomena to see how good it is for the body. But if we're good kinesiologists, Jeff should be able to test if that supplement's good for me, and I'm 3,000 miles away, and I could test it for him, or anybody else could test it for anybody, theoretically. So there's many discoveries since we've kind of taken on the stewardship of the technology. And one of them is, this technology, it had two big input stacks. So it would pull the energy in. Well, it started with one input stacks, and it went to two and more, but it would pull the energy in from the ether and then concentrate it at the bottom of an output stack. And down at the bottom of the output stack was a little place when you'd put the request to divinity, and then right in the beginning there were 3x5 cards. And it would say, I think we said, "Dear divinity, please do this." And then later on, we figured out we had to ask at the end of each request to say, "Only do this if it's in the highest and best interest of all creation, or do it in such a way that it is in the highest and best interest of all creation." We didn't know that back then. And we ended up, so the inventor was, he would charge up these crystals and put them all around the house. And then the charge would eventually go down, but that's when Jeff and I walked in that day. He just charged up a bunch of crystals and put them around the house. And that place was electric. It was like the hair on your arms would stand up, those goosebump things. So he was on the phone one day with a friend of his, and he just put a piece of marble in from a broken countertop. Those nice marble countertops. He'd found a broken piece, and he'd put it in there. And he charged it up in this output stack, and he was going to put it around the house. He pulled the piece of marble out, and he was holding it in his hand as he was talking to his phone on the friend, and they were on the phone for like half an hour. And when he hung up the phone, he noticed that the arthritic pain in his hand and arm had gone away, and he had bad arthritis. So that was, and again, we don't make health claims, and that's what happened in terms of talking to friends of his. He wondered if that would work if he sent it to a friend. And so he took this marble and couriered it over to Europe. And some friends of his who had arthritis, their arthritic pain would go away when they held it. And so that was the discovery that we made that, so the next discovery was that we could charge that piece of marble remotely with a picture. That's what I discovered that. And so that was exciting. I mean, we could have put a picture in of that piece of marble, and it would charge it back up, because they were shipping the marble back and forth from Europe. It was really expensive with all the courier fees. And so there's so many discoveries, and that sort of led to the service work where we would go on Google Earth. And this is just before 2012. So 2007, I came across the technology. I think 2009, Jeff flew up, and then we were playing with it. And I ended up living in the Middle East for a couple of years. And when I came back, we got into it again. We started working together in the coaching context. And we were doing service work for humanity up to 2012, Jeff, right?
Yeah.
And, I'll let you pick it up from there.
Zooming around the Earth on Google Earth. Yeah, so what we discovered is that we could raise consciousness in an area if we had an identifier like coordinates. So Google Earth was great because you could, fly around and then pick coordinates for an area and raise the consciousness. So yeah, we spent a whole year doing just service work, looking to raise in consciousness. And we can talk a little bit later about what it feels like in some of these places, what it feels like at different levels of consciousness. And it's, as we went more and more into this and really looked at, okay, we're raising consciousness. What does that mean? And I went back partly to my training in college, a science training. And, the belief there was that consciousness is only in the brain, that it's like neurochemical or it's neurons firing. And it just went so against what we were doing and what I had learned early on, near-death experiences and past lives and, consciousness kind of continuing from one life to another, that, there were so many other things happening in the world that people doing research, like in remote viewing, morphic fields like Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if you've studied some of his work, Clayton.
Yeah, Rupert Sheldrake, David Bohm.
Yeah, and I studied with Ken Wilber for a number of years. And sort of part of his integral theory is levels of consciousness. in different domains of your life, which was this, after I'd done that, and then I started working with you, and we were looking at my level of consciousness in different areas of my life. It was just the same as Ken Wilber's work, in spiral dynamics. Integral is, one of the kind of scales that they use. And Don Beck was, one of the original authors of that. And it was so interesting because freedom was a part of that as well. It's like you had a certain level, and then as you started to evolve through that there would be like a death of those old beliefs, and you would be free of those. And there'd be kind of a chaotic period where you don't really have the new beliefs formed yet, but you've got the old beliefs dead or dying. And so there's this chaotic period where then you're reforming at a higher level. And some people call that dark night of the soul, where things are reorganizing and you're moving to a higher level, but not yet gelled there. So that's so much more to consciousness than what's going on in your brain. And I know we'll get into it in future episodes as well. Like, where do your thoughts come from? Are they really your thoughts? Like we talked earlier about these societal thought patterns, maybe thought patterns that are in the land or in an area, or emotions that are in an area where maybe trauma occurred. Those kind of things that are, okay, these are not me. These are not just my thoughts thinking. They're something else happening. So what about how things feel like if there's these different fields of consciousness, there's things happening maybe perhaps in the land where there was trauma, or we go somewhere. How does that show up for you, Clayten, in your body? How do you feel that?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about humans, just as a way of surviving, we are very refined consciousness instruments in many ways. Just the fact that we survive in the world. And a lot of people use the metaphors of, there's a sixth sense we have for danger because that's what protected us from the saber-toothed tiger, or whatever you want to call it, in our ancestral days, we'll say. And that can go back a long way. And it was just back to the feelings. I mean, the higher your level of consciousness, it seems like there's a lot more sensitivity in your nervous system. And I think after the past life regression therapy and the changes I was able to make, I noticed that when I went into an area that my spidey senses were definitely stronger. Like there was a greater level of discernment. And I think that's true of anybody going up in consciousness. There is a greater awareness of your peaceful state and your and other states. And so, we talk with Jeff about, going into like an old prison. There's a lot of old prisons now that you can do tours in. One particular experience I had when I was in the Middle East, I was in this town called Nizwa. It used to be the capital of Oman. It was a fort in the desert that had a huge spring in it. And in the fort, there's literally a town almost inside the fort. It was around the fort, there was a town. The fort was pretty big. That's the way they used to build those. And in that culture, is they build a really large fort around the spring, and then a town would develop outside the fort, some of it inside if it was big enough. But there was one area where it was their prison cell in the fort. And I remember going down into that, like kind of the naive tourist, and it wasn't on the tour. I was just walking around because the tour guy was talking about all the stuff I knew about because I'd studied that country a lot. And because I was going to live there and I was really interested in it. So I went down into this prison cell, and for those who understand the Hawkins scale of consciousness, that prison cell calibrated at 5 out of 1,000, which is basically hell. And there were some beings down there that were soul trapped, I believe, in the suffering they experienced. And so that was a real visceral experience of that was the lowest consciousness place I'd ever been to at that time of my life. And it is the lowest one I've been into since. I would probably test the level of consciousness of an area before I went into it now, just because of what I experienced in that cell. It was very disturbing. It was a very, very dark place. And I've been to some pretty high places, and I noticed that, it's just much easier to think happy thoughts, to be at peace, to get better ideas about things that I'm curious about. And just actually at some point, there's an experience of almost being free of sensation in the body. There is this kind of connection that I had in the high places, where I didn't feel like I was leaving my body, but I was definitely aware I was more than a body. Where I was in the prison cell when I visited that, right? It was like like I could literally feel shackles on my arms and ankles, and there was a heaviness in my, like the heat was oppressive there anyway, and just this heaviness in my chest, and kind of that sinking feeling in my stomach. It's just like my battery's just getting drained being there. So I was there for maybe 30 seconds. I got the heck out of there. But it took a while to shake it off. So there's some extremes for me, Jeff. I mean, you might have a couple stories there on your own.
Yeah, I tend to feel it in my body, like either a heaviness, like in those lower places. Like I've been to some old battlefields where a lot of people died, and some prisons in England that I visited. And yeah, I feel it very heavy like that, sort of in the pit of my stomach, and very low energy. I always feel like it just drain me, like you were saying, your battery feeling drained. That lower consciousness feeling there is just heavy and draining. As opposed to the elevated, like when I was in the inventor's house that we were talking about, activation, where I felt very energized. And yeah, I know what you mean about that, like beyond the body feeling, where there's a connection to something bigger, much bigger than us, rather than this really, the dark ones seem like a really concentrated, very small experience versus a very elevated, big experience. And I've also felt that in cathedrals in Europe. And I was in one cathedral. It was really interesting. I was walking towards where the priest gives the sermon, and the closer I got, the more I felt the elevated feeling. And then when I walked away, I could feel it going down. So there was definitely a higher energy, higher consciousness area in that portion of the cathedral. And from what I've read since, the way it's designed, and perhaps the energetic structures underneath when they were there before they even built the cathedral, produced that high zone. And yeah, I feel it in my body as a sensation, as a tingling or a lightness versus a heaviness. We certainly over the past year have had some different consciousness experiences with the whole COVID, and like last summer, the world really was a different place. It felt really different. So as we walk around the world, what we're saying is there's fields of consciousness. There's areas that feel differently to us. They may be very high and elevating, or very low and draining and heavy. So it would be great, and it would be great for you as a listener to, as you're walking through your day, see what you notice in your body, like paying attention to the awareness. For me, it's kind of around my heart. It's around my stomach area. It might be what I perceive as my core, that I feel different sensations as I go into different places. Like you just walk into a dive bar and see how you feel, walk into a place of worship and see how you feel. And that in these next episodes, we'll talk a lot more about fields of consciousness, what that is, and what that means for us, really in terms of our freedom, in terms of our lives and kind of our happiness and freedom in the way we live our lives and interact with others.
Yeah, so I guess we're at closing thoughts, Jeff. And since I got the floor, I'll try to say something and give you a moment to think. About 8 years ago now, Jeff and I started the company. So September 24th, 2013, so 7.5 years. And a few years before that, I committed to do business as a spiritual path. And that was part of my exploration with my clients since 1995. Was really to specialize in working with business as a spiritual path oriented entrepreneurs. And those are great conversations, and it was a great space to be in. And FLFE has been a further expression of that personally. After I recommitted about 10 years ago, I was in a transition, like you were talking about, Jeff, when one door in your life closes and another one opens. The hallways are challenging, called that, or they can be.
Yeah.
And so I guess my invitation to you personally is to join us on this adventure of looking at business as a spiritual path, which we'll share with you our story and to share the adventure of exploring consciousness and empowering yourself to understand and celebrate being human. Humans are amazing creatures, and we're flawed, and we're amazing. And FLFE, Focus Life Force Energy, has been the peak experience for me in my business life, and working with Jeff has been another highlight of that. And I hope that we can share with you some of the joy that I've experienced in serving the world in this way. And I just look forward to sharing that with you all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it is a journey of freedom as well. And that, we look forward to sharing that journey of freedom with you, and where all these different aspects of consciousness sort of come together. And as Clayton said, is this amazing human experience. How can we consciously, to use that word, work with all these different aspects to be free? And to, with freedom comes, joyous living, and, deep loving relationships. So it's been quite a journey together, and we're really glad to share it with you.
Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, a podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of Focused Life Force Energy, or FLFE, for 15 days. This is a big part of our life's work, our goal being to support the optimal conditions for the evolution of consciousness in the economized society we live in.
FLFE creates a pristine, loving, energetic environment for people to thrive in. It is our free gift to you. No credit card is required. We invite you to subscribe to Fields of Consciousness podcast and tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.